death of a child is one of the greatest pains any loving parent could possibly bear. To lose something so special, which brings so much joy to one's life, would be every mother and father's worst nightmare. A journey far too agonizing to take, one which would leave them feeling desolate and alone, and on the verge of self-destruction. The tragedy of burying one's own child often results in ongoing, lifelong depression, and in many cases, suicide for those bearing the brunt of this kind of heartbreak. They end up living in a world of memories which they can no longer recreate, torturing themselves inside the walls of a prison from which they cannot escape. Back in March of 1990, this very misfortune descended upon a household located in Salina, Texas. The Footlights Ranch, a 13-acre property situated about an hour north of Dallas, was owned by Travis and Olivia Mabel. They had relocated there in 1983, shortly after Olivia had given birth to their son, Aiden. As a happily married couple, they hoped, in purchasing a larger home, to extend their small family. Although during those first years, they doted heavily on their only child. On the afternoon of the 13th of March, a 7-year-old Aiden had asked his mother if he could go off and play in the sprawling grounds surrounding the ranch. She had, of course, agreed, as she did so every day, on the proviso that he was back in time for his dinner. Aiden had whooped and cheered as he set off on yet another boyhood adventure, and Olivia didn't see him for the rest of the afternoon. By 5:30 p.m. that evening, however, he had still not returned, even though his dinner was sat on the table, going cold. Both parents set out to look for him, thinking he was probably having too much fun and had simply lost track of time, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of the situation. Not too far from the household, they found Aiden floating face down in a pond. He had fallen in and drowned. Travis and Olivia were beside themselves with grief over the death of their son, and unfortunately for them, their relationship just wasn't strong enough to withstand the heartache and pain they both felt. They blamed themselves, they blamed each other, both of them racked with a guilt that would never cease to weigh them down. Olivia withdrew into herself. She did not return to work, rarely left the house, ceased attending her local church, and began to shut out her friends, family, and eventually, even her husband. The couple divorced the following year, and Travis moved east to make a fresh start. Olivia, on the other hand, chose to remain at the ranch, living alone and in seclusion, surrounded by the 13 acres of wilderness attached to the household. No one ever saw or heard from her again, save for a brief sighting by a neighbour late in 1991. Phone calls and letters went unanswered. Visitors to the house were ignored, except for the groceries which she had delivered. But for all other intents and purposes, she was completely closed off from the rest of the world. Years went by without so much as a peep from her, and people began to wonder whether she even still lived at the property. That was until the 27th of February 1994, when the police department in Salina received a 911 call from an unknown source. The operator who answered the call heard only silence on the other end before the line clicked and eventually cut off after a couple of minutes. As procedure dictated, the police department began to trace the call, but before long, the phone rang a second time, and the operator was again met with the same eerie silence. In all, 3 calls were made from the same number, all of them silent, and all of them traced to the same address: the Footlights Ranch, the home of Olivia Mabel. A patrol car was sent to check on the house, but the police officers found that it was completely locked down. They couldn't see through any of the windows, which were whitewashed, and the front door had not been used in so long that it had swelled and bowed outwards into the door frame so that it was jammed shut. Thinking that someone could be in distress, the police officers broke open the front entrance and entered the stricken home, and what they found defied all logic. The interior of the house was in a serious state of neglect, with layers of dust piled upon the furniture and cobwebs infesting every crack, corner and crevice. Each room looked as though it had not been touched in years, let alone lived in, and this was the same scene that greeted the officers as they explored the rest of the household. That was until they reached what had once been Aidan's room. Inside, they found all of his clothing and toys stored neatly away in drawers and cupboards. Everything was pristine and tidy, no dust, no cobwebs. It had all been perfectly well kept. In the centre of the room, they found Olivia Mabel in a nightgown and slippers, sitting in a rocking chair, deceased. Clutched in her hands was a small doll made in her son's image, wrapped in pieces of his clothing. Officers reported that it looked as though she had been dead for a couple of months. In front of her was a makeshift altar made in Aidan's honour, decorated with candles, fresh flowers, and her late son's possessions, as well as photographs and drawings of him. Amongst his toys, they found heartbreaking letters written by a grieving mother to her lost son. Needless to say, it was quite upsetting for those present, but there was a question which hung bleeding in the air like an open wound. Who had made the 911 call? Francesca Santiago was one of the first officers on the scene, and she described what they found that day. There was no sign of forced entry, other than the front door where the police had come in, and no sign of anyone else having visited or having entered the property. All doors and windows were locked from the inside, and even the phone exhibited a layer of dust, showing no indication of having been lifted in order to make the call. And if that wasn't strange enough, Things took an even more bizarre turn when an officer examined one of the letters, which had obviously been written by Olivia. The exact wording was as follows: "My Aidan, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I should have never let it get like this. I'm leaving. I will not let you keep me, you vile, evil creature. Mommy's coming for you. Aidan, my sweet Aidan. Mommy loves you." The thing that both mystified and disturbed investigators about this letter was that it was dated the 27th of February 1994, the day the police had entered her home, the day her body had been found. Other worrying signs pointed to the possibility that Olivia had been dabbling in occult practices. Adorning the makeshift altar dedicated to Aidan, there were a number of characters written in Sanskrit, which when translated were found to spell construct or to build. It is believed that Olivia had been trying to construct a tulpa or thought form. Given the altar, Sanskrit, isolation, obsession, and finally the doll which was found clutched in her hand, this could be seen as a fair assumption. Olivia might have been channeling her boundless grief into manifesting an entity in her son's image. Tibetan Buddhism sheds some light on this practice, saying that a being can be created through sheer spiritual or mental discipline and powerful concentration of thought. Considering her desperation and powerful emotional state, could Olivia have constructed a being of pure thought? And based on her letter dated the 27th of February, could this being have slipped the shackles of her control and turned against her, perhaps taking her life in the process? Francesca in particular notes that she and other officers felt a strong, angry presence looming over the household when they arrived, and it is difficult to explain certain aspects of this case without considering the paranormal. The current owner, Christopher Hagen, has been unable to sell the property, and it has remained empty for almost 25 years. Prospective buyers are apparently put off by the oppressive atmosphere they feel upon entering the home. Christopher himself reported multiple paranormal occurrences during renovation work and beyond. In 2005, he invited Austin-based paranormal investigator Drew Navarro to visit the property. Navarro claimed that out of the hundreds of locations he has studied, he has never felt such an imposing force, and went on to report how he could not breathe upon entering the home. He described feeling a constant, shifting energy which behaved erratically, like a jealous child throwing a tantrum, and that at no point did it feel inviting. He finished by saying the house should be avoided and a serious intervention is needed, as he didn't quite know what he was dealing with. So what killed Olivia Mabel? Did she die of a broken heart, or was there something far more sinister at work? Before we make any assumptions, allow us to consider the alternatives. It is, of course, possible that someone entered the home, wrote the letter, and placed the call to the police, but there was no sign of forced entry, and coupled with the fact that the phone and house in general had not been disturbed in months, this seems unlikely. Our minds are drawn then to question whether this whole incident even took place at all. Whilst a death certificate does exist for 7-year-old Aidan Mabel, which determines a death by misadventure and lists both Travis and Olivia as his parents, amateur investigators have found no such death certificate for his mother. Secondly, there is no coroner's report detailing the cause of Olivia's death. Also noted is the complete absence of any online news articles regarding the bizarre circumstances in which her body was found. One would think that local press, at the very least, would have jumped on such a strange story, as they did with Christopher Case back in 1991, which raises yet another red flag. Finally, as far as we can tell, reports of this strange case only started to surface a couple of years ago. This was roughly around the same time that a Kickstarter campaign was initiated in order to fund a movie entitled Thought Form, based upon the events surrounding Olivia Mabel's death. Many skeptics point to this as a clear sign of viral marketing, something many film studios employ in this wonderful modern age of the internet. But as dubious as all this sounds, none of it is clear-cut proof of a hoax. Just because a death certificate for Olivia Mabel has not been found does not mean it does not exist. Relatives may have wished to keep her death out of the press. And finally, a couple of opportunistic filmmakers who stumbled upon an intriguing story and decided to make a film out of it does not mean the whole affair is part of a shrewd marketing campaign. When all is said and done, this story is out there, and whether it is true or not, it's sad enough to bring a tear to the eye and creepy enough to send a chill up the spine. If it is fictional, then it has done its job as a piece of art in making the viewer, listener, or reader feel at least something. If it is indeed true, however, then we can only hope that Olivia has finally been reunited with her beloved Aidan, and that they both rest in everlasting peace together.